Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Please let us know if you can't. But my name is Keisha Dupree. I'm a senior project analyst here at the CSG Justice Center, and I am so pleased to be able to welcome you all today for the webinar on navigating concerns on youth crime, violence, and behavioral health, 3 steps to take series. Wonderful. So before we start, I just want to give some housekeeping instructions and notifications. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will be able to provide access to this in the next few weeks on the CSG Justice Center website, along with today's slide deck. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Christina. Thank you all.
Thanks, Keisha. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Christina Gilbert. I am with the Youth Justice team here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I'm thrilled to be joined by my co-panelists, Carol Bogert, the president of the Marshall Project, Ginny Horan, public information specialist at Pierce County Juvenile Court, and Courtney McSwain, the director of communications with the National Youth Justice Network. NYJN. For more information about them, you can see their bios. As Keisha said, this is the Navigating Concerns on Youth Crime, Violence, and Behavioral Health, 3 Steps to Take series. This webinar is the first in a 3-part webinar series. Today, we will be focused on communication strategies. The next 2, coming in early 2025, will be focused on cross systems, policy, financing, and programming strategies, and on youth and family-driven solutions. Dates have not yet been announced, but will be coming shortly, so please look out for those soon. And before we really dive into the meat of today's webinar, which will be a great conversation, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background and context with just a few slides. Earlier this year, the CSG Justice Center analyzed the most recent behavioral health, arrest, and juvenile justice system data available to help policymakers better understand current national trends, place them in historical context, and identify key implications. I'm only going to be sharing just a few sort of key points and data points and slides from that analysis. The rest is on our website, and I encourage folks to do a deep dive, and we will be sharing those resources as well. But some of the key themes include that adolescents are increasingly experiencing mental health, school, and community violence challenges that can impact their well-being and ultimately their risk to themselves or others. And at the same time, youth arrests for violent offenses overall remain historically low. However, post-pandemic, youth arrests for homicide and weapons surged. Specifically, overall arrests for youth violence declined 54% from 2000 to 2022, and in 2022 remained near historic lows. However, youth arrests for homicides have increased for a decade and surged in 2022 to never before seen levels. At the same time, arrests for weapons offenses also spiked to levels not seen for a decade. Good news, potentially good news, is that while we don't have the full analysis, the new numbers we are starting to see from 2023 and 2024 is that those are dropping. Again, hopefully we'll have more analysis soon. But at the same time, despite those historic lows, public concern, media coverage, and political divisiveness on youth crime and violence is currently at levels not seen since the mid-1990s. And that's despite the fact that most young people involved in the juvenile justice system have not caused physical harm to another person. You can see the proportion of all youth at each decision point whose most serious offense was a non-person delinquent offense, and nearly 3/4 of young people arrested at the time of our analysis were there for non-person offenses, and almost 2/3 of young people on probation, certainly more than half of youth on probation and incarcerated were also there for a non-person delinquent offense. And so just with that context, there we go. With that context and those numbers in mind, I am going to turn to our panelists and engage them in a discussion from their very diverse perspectives around how we can counteract this tough on crime narrative and public perception about youth crime that doesn't necessarily reflect what is occurring in communities, while acknowledging that any serious offense of violence committed by a young person or perpetrated on a young person is of course serious, and we need to take those concerns seriously. But on with the bigger picture, really having a conversation about what this means. So to get started, I just want to sort of ask and start with Ginny, who again is a public information officer at the Pierce County Juvenile Court. From where you sit, why do you think there's such a gap between public perception of youth crime and violence and what the data shows, given those numbers?
Thanks, Christina. I think there's a couple of things at play that we see. I think one is just the prevalence and the access to information and news with social media, with the internet, and how quickly things spread that way. I think everyone has, in your communities, all the next door, the neighborhood apps, the Ring doorbells, and so you see all of that stuff popping up. And so I think the close proximity maybe sometimes will impact people's feelings of safety, right? And that's something that we can't really change or impact. That that is that's someone's feelings. And so to not minimize any of that, I think also another thing is just with what we're seeing in the media and the narratives that are being shared. And when you're talking about data that's being shared, oftentimes it's being shared without the context that's needed behind it. And a lot of the stories and incidences that are shared are often, very one-sided, or you have the point of view of like a police report. And so you don't really have the full picture of what the situation was, what actually happened leading up to, the said event, and different things like that. And I think oftentimes you can pull different data that can support your story however way you'd like it to go, right? You can pull any number and it can make people feel a certain way when you just share a large number out. And so one example of that I'll share when I first started in our position is just sharing like an overall referrals number, right? It can sound big for folks who have no idea in what context of, the number of young people we're talking about or anything like that. And so if you just hear 1,000 referrals, like that could sound big for somebody. But when you break that down to, okay, well, how many kids are we actually talking about with that? And it's like, okay, maybe it's 900 young people. And what does that look like in the grand scheme of like the actual population of the young people of this age group and this demographic that we're talking about? It's less than 1%. Right. And so that in and of itself right there, like combats the narrative of, all the young people are, out of control and youth crime and all of this stuff with everyone. And it's less than 1% of the population. And so really being able to drill down and being able to share numbers with context and that, but I think right now they're just, it isn't that. It's, you get one piece, here and there. And just with social media, I think it's everywhere right now.
Thanks so much. I want to pose that same question to my other panelists, if either of you want to add anything different. Carol, can I turn to you? Is there, from where you sit, why do you think there's a gap between public perception and data?
Well, it's a very complex question. So as I think as Jenny just suggested, there really are a number of factors. I do, when we talk about media coverage of crime and of juvenile crime, I do think we have to be really careful, and Jenny, you were just now, in differentiating between journalism about crime and criminal justice and social media like next door. And I've heard advocates in the juvenile justice space say, like, why don't journalists just stop covering crime? Why do they have to cover it at all? And the answer is that if social media are covering crime and the media are saying nothing about it, that only sends the credibility of the media plunging further than it's already gone. So you can't, we can't pretend that the crime that is happening isn't happening, right? That would be wrong. Even within journalism, there are so many different types of journalism. The Marshall Project, where I work is, as probably you all know, we focus exclusively on the criminal justice system. We do mostly investigative journalism, so the deeper dives and deep diving into the numbers and the data. We're big nerds. That's a long distance between us and local TV news. I think you also do need to be aware of the incredible pressures on the media business today I mean, commercial pressures, the number of journalists who have just lost their jobs, who have been kind of wiped off the map. Tens of thousands of journalists have lost their jobs in America in recent years. I've seen statistics that more than 2 newspapers close per week in this country. So we have a very devastated landscape. If you're like a New York Times reader or whatever, they're a behemoth, right? They've got, however, more than 10 million subscribers now, more money than God. But honestly, the rest of the landscape is so struggling. And the time that journalists have to dig into the details of a data story about juvenile crime in their city, we can't stress enough that they don't have the time, they don't have the resources. This is a profession that's under extreme stress. I think this is a bit of an evergreen. I mean, since the Gallup polls began in the early 1970s and they started asking American citizens, do you believe that crime is going up or down? Every single year, I'm pretty sure, I haven't checked this lately, but every single year Americans have said it's going up. Every single year. Including, the more than 20-year period that it just steadily sank, right? It doesn't matter. People always think crime is going up. Why is that? It is, of course, in part because of the prevalence of crime reporting on local television news, and a lot of other things besides. I also think we can't kind of fail to note a general unease in the population about safety, which comes from a lot of different directions. I mean, for example, more visible drug use on the street. I happen to live on a street. I live in New York City. There are 2 methadone clinics on my block and a third one being built as I speak. I have never been in any way, I've been approached, but never harmed in any way. It's not unsafe, but there are an awful lot of people using drugs on my street. And I know that an awful lot of neighbors in my building are extremely uneasy about that, and they associate it in their minds with crime. Even though it may not, the legalization of drugs, I think, has in many places has helped people feel that somehow crime is advancing upon them, and the powers that be just aren't defining it as crime anymore, but it makes people feel uncomfortable, rightly or wrongly. That's an emotional reaction. And finally, I think we would be remiss if we did not, particularly in this week, talk about the deliberate political misuse of the crime issue to foment fear in the population and a general sense of apocalypse, upon which political fortunes can be made. So that is no doubt. And we saw it in some ways even more so in the midterm elections when crime actually was up and it was demagogued to death. But certainly in the presidential election, crime rates also were an issue in national races as well as local ones. And, we can't exclude the fact that politicians will deliberately misuse data in order to gain office.
Thank you so much. Courtney, same question. We've heard a lot of great, clearly it's complex. There are a lot of reasons, but from where you sit, anything additional to add around the difference between public perception on youth crime and violence and the data?
Yeah. So at NYJN, we're really digging into strategy and infrastructure around how do we change narratives. And we're working to make that distinction between messaging, which I see as sort of a short-term project related to campaigns, legislative cycles, and then really changing these huge boulders of ideas that all of us carry within us. And so if folks will allow me to get a little bit nerdy, Carol introduced the word nerd, so I'm gonna get a little bit nerdy for a second, if folks will allow me, to just kind of bring in a couple of concepts, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I wanted to read a definition of the word ideology and then read a definition of the word hegemony. So I'm taking this out of the book. There's a book called Practical Radicals, and it is by Deepak Bhargava and Stephanie Luce, who are both organizers and have been working in this field for a long time. And so they define ideology as how people make sense of the world, the systems of values, beliefs, and norms that shape how people make meaning, from explicitly ideological beliefs to common sense to unexamined habits of thought. And I want to underline in people's minds habits of thought. And then if we think about ideology, the concept of ideological power. So who has the power to affect those ideas and affect how they are proliferated through our culture, how they are proliferated through our media? And Carol certainly names like political use of ideas and ideology during campaign seasons and outside of campaign seasons. So different people have different levers of power to sort of tap into those ideologies, but these ideologies are carried within us and reinforced and remixed and reinvigorated over centuries, right? So hegemony, which was coined from an Italian theorist, Antonio Gramsci, and it speaks to the political and cultural domination of one group over another through manufactured consent of the population. And so that really goes to this idea that there's a power dynamic and play, but also we as individuals are sort of playing into these carrying of these ideas, often inadvertently. So often we don't actually realize and know that we are carrying these narratives with us and that we are acting upon them through these habits of thought. So it's just a habit. So when we see a media headline that talks about crime in a particular way, and that talks about young people being involved in maybe a property crime or car theft or whatever it might be, and if that headline maybe names a neighborhood that happens to be a neighborhood where predominantly people of color live, and if typically with someone under 18, I don't think they can use photos, but let's just say it's an 18-year-old and they use a photo, and that photo is a person of color, African American, or Latinx person, then all of a sudden these habits of thought start to trigger in our minds. And these habits of thought about Black and brown young people being criminal, being violent, being we need to do something to sort of tamp down on those kids, those bad kids. They need to be punished. They need to be locked away. We need to create more laws to lock up more young people because they're getting out of control. These are habits of thought that we're carrying around with us that are really ingrained in us from centuries of ideology that come from white supremacist ideology, that come from the legacy of slavery, that come from the legacy of Jim Crow. And we have lots of studies and lots of films and documentaries. We have the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. We have 13th by Ava DuVernay. We have Rage of Innocence by Kristen Henning. We have these studies and these bodies of work that show us how these narratives have been constructed that really demonize people of color and young people of color in particular. And certainly, the super predator myth of the 90s was a manifestation of that. So we're carrying around centuries of these ideologies with us, and we don't even really know it until all of a sudden they get triggered by these media headlines. And so back to your original question around what's the gap, what's the gap between seeing the data that says youth crime is down, and if there was a blip right after COVID, I think your data indicated that 23, 24 has indicated it's gone back down, or we're seeing a trend go back down. But seeing that blip after COVID, one would think that the trigger would be, oh, something happened in 2020 that then, we all were in a mental health crisis, but certainly young people whose brains are still developing, who didn't have access to resources, whose worlds were changed in monumental ways. maybe there's a manifestation of that happening. But instead of that being the reaction goes back to something that's very familiar to us. And the familiarity is, oh, here they go. This is confirming something I'm already carrying with me, which is this idea of who Black and brown children are. So I say all of that to say, I think that gap is really a gap of centuries of doing what it does. And then the question for us, for advocates for NYJN and for all of us really, is how do we interrupt that? How do we interrupt those ideologies? And I think we'll get into strategy conversations a little bit later, but I'll say that it really is a deep commitment to getting into relationship with people, to organizing with people, and being willing to go to cultivate the tools to allow people to interrogate those narratives that we carry within us internally, but then also organizing so that we can make demands of our elected officials and of our systems to shift the conversation and shift the lens away from these young people are acting in this way to these systems are failing our young people. And we have demands upon these systems to do better. And how do we shift our narrative lens to be able to carry that message forward?
Thank you so much. That you said so much. And I think I heard a lot of pieces here. Clearly, it's going to take to change the bigger picture, to change public perception and change the public narrative overall will take deep commitment, time, all of that. And I recognize we also have a very diverse panel just here with us and also on here. And so, and you did start getting into some of the like big picture strategies. I do want to also talk about like what are some of the concrete strategies folks can use right now, no matter what space you're in. And so I'm hoping we can also come back to this sort of toward the end, but just kind of use this framing of all of these complex reasons for the public shift. I heard habit of thought. I heard sort of the disparate types of media that are out there. I heard, politics and power dynamics and decriminalization of drugs. Like those are a lot of big, big topics. And at the same time, folks are going about their day to day. And, I know that there are some small things that folks can do, small and bigger. And so with that, I'm going to shift a little bit back to Ginny and thinking about sort of the agency perspective and folks who work in juvenile justice agencies. When we met and started planning for this webinar, you shared that you're the first person ever to have a public information officer position in Pierce County Juvenile Court. And we know that many, many juvenile justice agencies don't have, first of all, a public information officer or any sort of communications staff at any level. And so given that, how can we advocate for agencies to invest in such a function? And what are some of the benefits of having someone like you or a role like yours within a juvenile justice agency to help counter some of these narratives?
Yeah, so I think just a little background. So I've been here at Pierce County Juvenile Court a little over 3 years now. And so I was the first person to start this role. And really, when our leadership team is talking about it, I mean, they've been doing the work here in Pierce County, doing juvenile detention alternatives initiatives and probation transformation work for over 20 years now, right? And all the folks who have been here before me just head down, like working hard and grinding in the community, doing grassroots efforts, and really making a huge and tremendous impact in the shift in how we work with young people and community and families. But they really realize, kind of getting to the point of like, but what's next? Like, how do we get it to the next level when you talk about like really impacting change, like outside of our system, addressing root causes? Like, how do we stop young people from even, getting connected with our system? Really, that's the end goal. And really being able to get other systems to come to the table and work together was, they needed a role like this, right? Someone who that was their primary function, was to figure out, how are we engaging and communicating internally, making sure our folks within our agency understand the work and can be advocates out in the community and can talk about what we're doing. And then externally, like how do we connect with folks at a different level, make sure that we are being invited to the right tables and in spaces where I think oftentimes, you know, they're out there talking about youth justice and different things. And, you know, how can we change these? Yet folks from juvenile court aren't even invited, you know, into these spaces. So how do we make ourselves a presence in that space? And so, you know, I think that the role of this, you know, communications really is, you know, a role of everyone, but I think having a dedicated person to be able to do that, having someone who can help you craft messaging that the community can understand. And let's face it, I mean, this is system work and there's a lot of jargon, right? And even when I joined, my background is in, I spent 17 years in nonprofit youth development, and coming in, it was just like, wow, just trying to learn the work, but then understand like what they're talking about, you know, having all the data and the numbers and the acronyms, and like folks in the community aren't going to understand this. And so being able to have someone in that can help break that down. And, you know, Courtney, you kind of talked about like, it's that, like, how do people receive the messages, you know, knowing all of their backgrounds and their histories and their experiences, like, how can you connect with them? And so being able to modify, you know, whoever you're meeting with or having conversations with, being able to show up to meet them where they're at as well, to be able to hear what we're trying to talk about and to understand the work that we're doing. And so just to have someone that can really help drive that work forward within the agency, I think is really important. And I know that it is different, and you know, all the jurisdictions and agencies across the country are set up very differently, but it was definitely a priority for us here with our leadership, with our executive committee, to fight for and advocate for a position to be housed solely within juvenile court outside of our the county communications department folks, to really have, you know, my work be solely around juvenile court.
Thanks so much. And just given that outside of, or while folks are advocating for that, do you have any advice for those folks who don't have that? And like, are there some simple maybe communications activities that other folks within the agency without having that expertise could do to really raise the profile of, you know, what's a more research-based public safety response rather than sort of the just throwing our hands up and saying youth crime is out of control?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just starting internally, right, with your team, being able to be transparent with what's going on, sharing your data with your team too, so that everyone is aware and everyone's kind of talking the same language. They understand where your values are and the work that we're doing. I think one of the things that they've done so well here at in Pierce County is the work within our culture within our agency. Right. And so having that kind of the leadership feeling that no matter where you're at, that we all can be empowered to talk about this work. But that does take, you know, being transparent and sharing what's going on, sharing our data as we're getting it, as we would, you know, with external folks as well, so that they're ready. I think being able to do it in and being mindful of like the language too, and having even that internal shift of the language and how we talk about the work, you know, subtle changes, like, you know, talking about youth justice, not juvenile justice, and young people that we're working with. So some of those, I think, subtle changes that make a big impact really do help. I think having all of our folks internally, all of our community partners, and that we work with, understanding what we do makes a big difference. So we had folks coming in this year, and that was one of their feedbacks and takeaways after a site visit was, wow, like no matter who I talked with, whether it was, you know, a probation counselor or someone in the leadership role, one of your community partners, you all were saying the same thing. And I was like, yes, like that's the hope and that's the intent, right? Is that, and so that doesn't take necessarily a person like me, you know, it does take, you know, everyone to be on the same page and the understanding of what the goal and the values and the mission and what you want for the work, and I think in your community to be doing.
Great, thanks. Certainly consistency. Courtney, I want to turn back to you, and you know, you started, but also, so Ginny from the agency perspective, and you from a more advocacy perspective. We know for advocacy efforts to be successful, you need good messaging and compelling content. And as someone who has led a narrative change working group of state-based advocates for some time now, I think maybe a couple of years, what are some lessons you've learned? And do you have any advice for advocates who are working in these states to help change public perception about youth crime and violence? And I'm going to add, you know, both in the short term and in the long term. So things they can do immediately, and also bigger picture, going back to your previous answer.
Yeah. what have we learned? So I'm going to say that I think the biggest lesson we learned has actually not been a messaging lesson. It's been an infrastructure and capacity lesson. I think on both the youth and the adult legal system reform transformation world, I think there's sort of this collective coalescing around messaging that relates to reclaiming safety for communities as being resourcing communities, not investing in carceral state or investing in carceral responses. I think we're seeing people on the adult side and the youth side bringing that messaging into their work. Certainly at NYJN, that's our kind of messaging principle. We've been using the tagline, "Whole communities are safe communities," for the past year in the materials that we put out. And we, this year or last year, time is moving, so time is becoming amorphous, but our most recent policy platform was titled "Resourcing Communities," and that was really all about how putting the resources that young people need in communities is a better option for creating community safety than investing in the carceral state. And that's borne out in the research. It's borne out in anecdotal evidence. It's borne out in what communities and young people offer to us in focus groups. So I think that's the message that I see the justice community coalescing around. And I think that it's a message that's been proven to work. The Vera Institute, which I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with, has been doing a lot of research and putting out a lot of data that shows that messages that really focus on safety as prevention, safety as resources, works with voters when it's very clear and very direct and intentional. So I think that's a message that, I think we should all be sort of coalescing and getting behind in some way. And I think if there's an immediate thing that people can do is sort of figuring out in your local community, wherever your community of influence is, how can you start to have conversations and talk to people about what are their feelings around safety? And again, start to tease out some of those ideas and ideologies and narratives that they're carrying around, and then figuring out ways to just offer some interrogation of that. And with that said, I think the biggest area of investment that I see from an advocacy perspective is really capacity and infrastructure. Because even with those messages and even with those messaging guides, and we share messaging guides and talking points with each other so that we all can be on similar pages, there just isn't enough capacity to mobilize people to get those messages out in communities and to really, again, mobilize people to make demands of their elected officials and systems to respond to those messages. So we have the messages and we know that they resonate with people, when they're voting or they're in the exit polls. But when it comes down to sort of these rapid response moments, when there's a legislation that's, trying to roll back, raise the age, or trying to, roll back efforts or stop efforts to raise the minimum age, or roll back these reform efforts that we've been working on for decades, I think the challenge is mobilizing people in those moments to get the messages and get the narratives out to enough people that can make enough demands on their elected officials to act. And so I would say, along with a focus on what it is that we're saying, I think we also need to focus on how are we mobilizing people and building constituencies that can be saying it, not just coming from the advocates, sort of the organizations, but coming from actual people who are, constituents of these electeds to make these demands.
Thank you. Carol, I want to turn to you, thinking about, messages and the people that are mobilizing. What you've heard both from an agency perspective and an advocacy perspective in this whole conversation thus far, we know one piece of it is the media, right? And we did talk earlier about the difference in the types, but do you have any advice for how agency folks, advocates, anyone, stakeholders can best engage with journalists in both traditional and digital media to effectively raise the profile of youth justice issues?
Sure. I think, Courtney raised a really interesting point about, and I think many of us are wondering kind of like what in light of political changes that we saw unfold this week, like where are we putting our efforts? What is to be done? And is it kind of shoring up and arming the faithful, so to put it? Or is it reaching out to the unpersuaded? Like those are actually two very different kinds of activities. And Courtney, I think you made an eloquent case in some ways for shoring up the faithful and, mobilizing people, as you said, to make demands of their electeds. And, that's important work. I guess I would, just in thinking about the media specifically, I think that is the opportunity potentially to reach people who are not persuaded. The people who don't agree with you yet, who are not kind of in your camp, but not necessarily opposed to you, or maybe they're not thinking about this issue every day. And I think, I was a communications director for almost 20 years, helping an advocacy group to shape communications messages. I used to work at Human Rights Watch. And, kind of consistently I think the toughest thing for advocates is remembering that the rest of the world does not care about what you do. They are not thinking all day long about what you're thinking all day long about. And to hook somebody's attention requires actually a pretty dramatic reordering of your own way of thinking about the issue. You do need to use all of the expertise and smarts at your disposal to do what I think Jenny was talking about, like what is that message? The fact that everybody in your agency, Jenny, was sort of saying to journalists the same thing proved to be very powerful for them. Like, oh, I'm not just being given a line by somebody who works for the government, like this is consistently just the actual truth. So, defining what it is that you want to say, I think is very important. But I think one of the critical things that advocates really struggle with is not saying too much. We all suffer from a tendency to talk too much. We've got so much to say. It's so important. Let me tell you everything. Wait, but there's this other piece of data you need to know too. There's just, you spend your whole day on these subjects and you want to really give a comprehensive look. You finally got a journalist on the phone, but actually, you have to think about information as a pyramid. What's the number one thing that you want to get across? And what, if you have a second minute to talk, is the number two thing that you want to get across? And, really create a hierarchy of messaging in your mind and dole it out as necessary. Make sure that the one single most important thing that you need to say gets said. I think, I often liken sort of media attention to like a lighthouse. If you think about the light from a lighthouse that is kind of swinging around all the time, the instant that spotlight lights on you, you have to be ready. Because one thing about the media, which has only gotten more intense as the media have kind of proliferated with social media, is this wild swings of the herd. So there's like 10 seconds where people are interested in your issue before they swerve and get interested in, Jeffrey Epstein or Taylor Swift or, who knows where the spotlight of attention is going to swing next. If it's on you for a second, you cannot lose the moment. You have to be ready. You have to know in advance what that message is and be ready to convey it. And, one other thing I would say is just that we live in very, these are visual times. The media is increasingly visual. A great frustration for those of us who, honed our wordsmithing capacities over many decades of higher education. And it turns out that people don't want to read a lot. People want to be told things in a graphic, or, in a simple, we're all, I don't have to tell you this, lots of us are on Instagram, right? What's going to stop you Somebody on Instagram once said, we're looking for the thumb stopper. So what is the thing that will make people stop scrolling and look? And we live in an attention deficit economy, right? So to get people's attention and hold it for a minute is really hard. And it's not a skill set that people who work in agencies or as advocates necessarily have honed. You know, you're analysts and experts, and you do go into the detail. And effective media work means kind of pulling yourself out of all that and coming at it from another way. I'm a person who knows nothing. I have a second to focus on this issue. What do I need to know, and what's going to be the single most persuasive fact or piece of data or soundbite that you can give me? I know this is frustrating, and it's like, ugh, stop dumbing me down. The whole problem is that this country's too dumb. I get it, but this is reality.
Thank you. Well, you all have certainly held my attention. I love some of those analogies, though. They're very helpful. I know you already started, but are there any other examples from your own either current or previous experience, Carol, that may highlight some sort of do's and don'ts for trying to elevate certain types of stories and information related to youth crime, in addition to the, one fact, not all of the details? That was certainly one of the things I heard from you.
Well, I mean, I think this, you all may not agree with me, and I did just talk about the media moving in a herd, and we certainly know how there has been sometimes an avalanche of misleading coverage on, a single incident or on trends in youth crime generally. But it is the case that journalists love things that are counterintuitive. So if you can say the general perception out there is X, but I'm here to tell you Y or Z, or you know what I mean? I don't mean YWHY. I mean, like, you think one thing, but actually another thing is true. That's surprising. And you have to remember that the news business is based on, like, it's called news because it has to be new. So I'm always taking out of people's headlines like continue. Like, that's not news. If it's continuing, nobody's going to write about it. That's not new. What's new? What's surprising? What's different in what you found? What will push its way? And also, I think it's helpful. Look, I don't want to minimize the damage that a bad media story can do, or the fact that there are nefarious reporters out there who really will misquote you and kind of screw you. That happens. But in general, if you treat journalists as the enemy, they will not act as a friend. And if you are hostile and suspicious of them and their motives, that's very frustrating for a journalist. So you have to understand them as your ally. You are trying to arm them with information that they can use. And most importantly, you have to understand how journalism works, the hierarchy of journalism. A reporter who's calling you has to persuade her boss that this is a good story and that it merits, major attention on the webpage or, on the front page or in the evening broadcast. So you have to think of yourself as giving that journalist the tools to make a successful argument to their boss. Here's why this is important. Let me tell you why this breaks through, because there are 1,000 things vying for attention at any news outlet. And you have to help them make the case that this one breaks through. This is new. This is fresh. This is different. This will get your readers' attention, and it's important. And a journalist does want to know that. If you can give them that, you're helping them, and then they can help you.
Thank you. I certainly heard some threads around, there was a lot in there, but also some threads around building relationships with journalists, which is also where Courtney started with, not necessarily with journalists, but relationships, and Ginny with, the community relationships. So that's certainly another thread I want to pull out. Just with the end of our time here, folks, I don't see any Q&A in the chat. If there are any, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can try to answer them at the end. But just to, wrap up here before any questions and sort of final words, I want to just go through all three of our panelists again. And in addition to anything else you really wish you had just shared that you didn't get a chance to, if you could sum up your top 3 steps. This webinar is framed as we really want it to be solutions oriented. What can somebody do when they go back to their organization, their community, their agency? From your perspective, your top 3 steps for the most effective strategies, tactics, or other recommendations for raising the profile of youth justice issues in a positive manner, what would they be? And I think I'll go Ginny, Courtney, Carol, if that's okay with you. So Ginny, your top 3 takeaways for folks today.
Yeah, so I think just when thinking about like proactive engagement with our media, stakeholders, and community, summed it up with 1, simplify how we talk about the work and being really intentional about the language that we're using when we talk about it. 2 would be addressing concerns with relevant information and data and solutions. And then lastly, preparing people to validate our work, in the spaces that they operate. And so I know we've heard from both Carol and Courtney about this too. So for us, connecting with those in positions of power who have the power in different spaces and meet with them, share the information with them so that they can be out there speaking on our behalf as well.
Thank you so much. Courtney?
Yeah, so I put in the chat a link to NYJN's Narrative Organizing Theory of Change. And it says call for funders. So if there are any funders out there, this is particularly for you, but it's also for everyone. And I will name as the first thing, I would say getting organized and really focusing on coalition building. I think one of the key things that I see in this work in trying to shift narratives is that this isn't a solo project. And again, speaking from the advocacy perspective, no one organization can do this alone. This is a lot of work. We talked about the complexity of it. We talk about the depth of it. We talked about the centuries of narratives that we are trying to work against and to move. So this is like really, really long-term, deep work that requires coalition building, requires organizing in the non-rapid moments. So doing the work now to bring people together, to talk about the narratives, to talk about the practices we can use to build relationships with each other through narrative, through conversation circles, through, sharing our stories, just not from a place of trying to get a reporter to write about it, but just sharing our stories with each other as a relationship building tool. Those are the things that we can do in the non-rapid moments, so that when the rapid moments come, we have a constituency of people to gather together. And then that goes to number 2, which is just the infrastructure building, thinking about, I like to think about yes and. So we need, and this will be a pitch for like the communications world, we need people who are on the media stuff, who are doing the media outreach, who are engaging, who are pitching, who are coming, who are doing all of that work. And we need concentrated people who are really developing these infrastructures that we need to do this long-term in-depth work. Those are 2 different jobs and we need both of them. So yes, and to both of those things. And then I would just name the third thing, really trying to draw out storytelling practices that heals what I call narrative oppression, or, that kind of internalized narrative ideology that we carry around with us that I talked about at the beginning. We aren't going to shift these narratives solely through messaging. We've got to do that internal work of giving people space, opportunity, and practices to interrogate those narratives within themselves. So bringing those practices, again, I mentioned, holding story circles, one-on-one conversations, creating a narrative change practice group within whatever your organizing base is, and just giving space for people to talk about these things that they're carrying with them those are the tools that we're going to need in order to start doing that excavation work of really kind of getting at the internal root of the things that we carry with us, so that we can recognize when we see something that doesn't make sense in the media, right? So right now, again, I talked about those habits of thought. We see something in the media that doesn't really hold true, but we don't really have the tools to interrogate it because it confirms something in us. So we got to do that excavation work so that then when we do see something, we go, oh, that's not actually accurate. And we don't carry that with us to someone else in another conversation, and we don't perpetuate that.
Thank you. Carol, top 3 steps or recommendations?
Well, I think it would be, have your data ready. Just have it ready. Whatever are the stark facts that can support your case, have it ready and keep it continuously ready. If it needs to be refreshed, somebody has to be in charge of that. Put somebody in charge. I would say, often journalists are on deadline and they can't kind of wait around while for a day you figure out who the right spokesperson is or put that data together. Like, have it ready. And prepare the message in advance. Just talk with your team and figure out what is the point you're trying to make. And honestly, like, how shall I put this politely? Don't let the lawyers write your soundbite. Like, it has to sound like a human being is talking. Like, the thing you need to know about juvenile crime is blah 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 blah. It's not, although comma, just get to the point and just have all that at the ready for the moment when the spotlight of media attention falls on you. And to the extent that you have staff to be proactive and kind of, and I'm not exactly sure who's on this call or how diverse this group is. I mean, government agencies are not generally in the business of calling reporters and saying, hey, how about a story? But advocates can do that. So knowing who those journalists are, knowing something about them, like, again, they're human beings. What have they written about before? If you're going to reach out to them, say, hey, I really love that piece that you wrote out of, Baltimore last week. I thought you really got it exactly right. But I also thought you might like to know X, because that is also true. And it follows on what you were saying before. It's media work is a retail business. It's not about sending out your press release to a giant list that somebody put together 5 years ago. Half of the journalists on it have lost their jobs and the other half are not reading press releases. It's really know your customer. What do they write about? What do they care about? What have they written about before? And what's going to most appeal to them about what you know to help get a different narrative into the mainstream.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions in the chat, and as a lawyer, I will not take offense to that comment at all. I think it's probably pretty accurate about the sound bites. I think, Carol, you may have just answered the first question around what are your thoughts about taking a proactive approach? And I think that's that outreach around, yeah, sort of, you have a bank, if you have 100 positive media stories and something negative happens, it's like a bank account, you've got those relationships folks are reporting. So I think that was answered. Is there specific resources that could be contracted to help develop these specific type of public messaging? I know there are certainly many strategic communications consultants and groups out there in the justice space, but I don't know if anyone else wants to has anything else to add. Certainly you can follow up with any of us on that. I have not had a chance to read these other ones yet. Thank
I
you.
just put one
Yep,
resource in the
thank you.
chat that I wanted to share with the NAKC Foundation, who's done a great messaging toolkit based on their research around public perceptions and how they view things. And so I just dropped that in there. That has been really fantastic. That might be helpful.
Thanks so much. I think this next question, I think, Carol, you also kind of answered this in your last question around Do you have any recommendations on how to pitch these stories to journalists? Do you think pitching expert availability can be effective if there isn't necessarily a breaking news story in our research?
No, I don't think that's effective. I think calling somebody and saying, hey, just so you know, we have an expert. It's like, okay, but I'm not doing that story today and I don't need to take that call. And so I wouldn't do that. I guess it's okay to, maybe have that, if you can have that available somewhere on a website so the journalist can just see quickly, like, okay, I need somebody on a story. I'm working on it right now. I need help. If I can find the name of that person quickly or be directed to them quickly, that will help. I think the other part of that question though, oh, it just disappeared.
Oh.
Sorry. Yeah, in the overstuffed media space. Sorry, I can no longer access it. I'm not sure.
Oops, sorry.
Anyway, maybe that mostly covers it.
I think that covers it. Thank you. And then this last question, I think, is not necessarily about community, it's more about incarceration. And I'll encourage you to come back for our a second webinar and future work of the Justice Center, juvenile justice work on sort of the policy strategies. This is one little piece of how we address these larger issues. Last question. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. So
Can I just say
yes,
one thing?
please, Carol, please.
Yeah, just that I actually do think there's no question that bad news is news and good news is not. Like, dog did not bite anybody is not a news story. Dog bit somebody is a news story. But I do think there's a role for solutions. There's something called the Solutions Journalism Network, which is really trying to encourage the media to focus more on solutions because people actually do want to know about things that work. So if you can, I think that was the part of the earlier question actually was like, yeah, is there a story of solutions? We just did a whole podcast about alternatives to policing. Like so many police departments in America now are using, with varying degrees of success to be fair, but non-police responses, social workers, mental health workers, drug, addiction experts or whatever it might be. And I think that kind of is surprising to people. Like that falls into the, oh, wait, what? That's happening? I didn't know that. That's kind of interesting. Huh, how's that going? If there are things that are working, if there are youth diversion programs, again, it's a little bit hard, like, hey, in this youth diversion program, like nobody committed a crime after it. If you can think of a way to frame that isn't too, dog didn't bite man. But I think also to the extent that you are able to direct journalists to people who are specifically involved, like it's one thing to say this youth diversion program worked. It's another thing to say this youth diversion program worked, and here are 3 people involved with it. Here are their phone numbers, and you can call and talk to them and get their perspective. Because they're not just a bureaucrat or an advocate, valuable though all of you are, it's not going to be enough for the journalist to build a story.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. I just want to express my, no, you're perfect. I have 1 minute to thank you all. I want to express my deepest gratitude for all of my co-panelists. Also, thank you to Keisha and Hyla, our operations staff here at the Justice Center. As I mentioned, this webinar was recorded. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with questions. And please do look out for the next 2 webinars, which will be coming in early 2025. We'll announce those dates soon. I learned so much on this webinar, and I'm so excited to think creatively and collaboratively with the folks here and our audience members about how we can support you in your jurisdictions and in your communities on implementing some of these strategies, both on the short-term, smaller scale and the bigger picture, really rethinking things. So again, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next round of webinars.